Thank you. $6 billion. That's the amount of money people like you and me will leave on tables across the country each year as tips for servers. $6 billion in the Canadian economy. What I'd like to do today with this talk is I'd like to evaluate the effectiveness of tipping. We're going to ask ourselves some questions as consumers. We're also going to look at maybe some of the hidden effects that tipping causes in restaurants. I'd like to try to rationalize the process and walk you through it. And hopefully at the end we'll try to ask ourselves when we leave here to rethink tipping the next time we're in that situation. Before I go into some of the points I'd like to make today, I'd like to set the context by giving you a little bit of history of tipping. Tipping in restaurants anyways. The accepted practice of tipping, the accepted history of tipping dates back to 18th century Britain, when you would have noblemen racing on their horses through the countryside. They would stop off at a public house and either to quench their thirst or to water their horse, and they would have cards with them. And the cards would have waxed with candle wax on them, a halfpence or a farthing, and they'd walk into the public house and they'd give it to the publican or the barkeep, and it would have written on the card, "To ensure promptitude." And this was their way of asking to be served in an appropriate fashion, and hence tipping was formed. Fast forward 200 or so years to the present day, and tipping is no longer really practiced in Europe as we know it, but it's rooted in our culture in North America. It's part of our economic restaurant model, and it's part of our culture as a society. What I'd like to do as well is introduce this aspect of social norm, which is what tipping has become, in fact, in our society. And a social norm is something that is accepted in our society. It's something that's expected, a behavior that is expected of us. And for the case of restaurants, it's when we go into a restaurant, we're expected to leave a tip. And if we don't, we may feel guilty about that. We may feel like we're a cheapskate. We may feel like we're ripping off the server. And this aspect of tipping evolving from a recognition piece for service to a social norm has really, really made the question of tipping and its effectiveness forefront in my mind. I'd like to walk you through what maybe is most important to you and just some of the facts about tipping and consumers, because it's something that we all have in common. We all tip at some point in restaurants. So let's talk about some of the research that's been done, and there's many tipping scholars out there. The first thing is that you, as consumers, believe that tipping works. You like to do it. You like the power of having that control in the relationship with the server, of saying, I'm going to only tip you if you give me good service. And you think that you actually do this. What the research shows is, though, that you don't do this. You don't actually tip based on the service quality that you receive. And this has been argued back and forth, and I guess I'll summarize it by saying the relationship between quality of service and your tipping behavior is very small and somewhat insignificant. In fact, there are two determinants of your tipping behavior that far outweigh service quality, and I'm going to introduce them to you now. The first is we tip more than anything on our previous tipping behavior. So me, I'm a 15%er. Who else is a 15%er out there? Okay, so 98 times out of 100, whether the service is moderate, adequate, good, very good, I'm going to tip 15%. I may vary a little bit in that band if I don't have my reading glasses with me, or if for say I can't do the math exactly. So there may be a little bit of variance, but I'm pretty much going to tip 15% all the time, 98 times out of 100. There may be the odd time where I tip 20% or 5%, and that would be the exception rather than the rule. The other determinant of tipping behavior, the other key driver, is the fact that we tip on the amount of the check. Okay? We tip on the amount of the check. And I'm going to argue, by telling a story, that this makes absolutely no economic sense. So my story is a futuristic one, because tonight I'm going to go out with my wife for dinner. We're celebrating a special occasion. And I'm a bit of a wine guy, so I'm going to buy a $100 bottle of wine, and I'm going to splurge. I'm going to go all out and treat ourselves to a bottle of wine. And the server is going to come over, and the server is going to open that wine, pour the wine, refill it when need be. And being the 15%er that I am, I'm going to leave the server $15 based on the value that they have added to my meal by opening the bottle of wine and serving it to me. Let's pretend there's another couple beside us, and they're not celebrating. They're just out for a regular dinner, and they buy a $50 bottle of wine. Well, you know what? They're going to get the exact same service from that server. There's going to be the presentation of the label, the opening of the wine. There's going to be the refilling. It's going to be the exact same value added as my $100 bottle of wine. Guess what? They're 15%ers too. So what's the tip they're going to leave on a $50 bottle of wine? $7.50. So here's the first question I really want you to ask yourself. The server has created the same amount of value in this dining equation. I've just spent more money, and I'm tipping twice as much as the people beside me. Not only do I have to question myself as a consumer whether that makes economic sense, I have to question the restaurateur. You're going to charge people more service charge when they spend more money in your restaurant for the same service? I don't think that works. Tipping does something else, and this has been researched to death, especially in the United States. And this may come at first of a bit of surprise to you, but I think you'll understand it as I go further along. Tipping promotes discrimination. Tipping promotes discrimination. Studies have shown that different races, different ethnic backgrounds, cultures tip differently. And guess who knows this? Servers. Servers know this. They know through experience. They also know that men tip better than women. Sorry, ladies. They know that small parties of 1 or 2 tip better than large parties. That's why when we go to restaurants in groups of 8 or 10, they always slap on that automatic service charge. They also know that business people tip better than families. Research shows that servers go to the table, in many cases, with already a predetermined value of what kind of tip they're going to get from the guests. And they will adjust their service accordingly and focus on the people that they think will get the biggest tip. My research partner, Mike Van Nassau, and I asked 50 restaurateurs if that exists in their restaurants. Guess how many said that it occurs in their restaurants? 50. They know it happens. I would argue from the restaurateur's point of view that you should expect the same level of service for all patrons coming into your restaurant, no matter what their gender or their race. That's the second point I want to make. Now, if we look at the next slide, these are the scales of justice. And I'm going to go back to context a little bit, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about my history and my experience, because I worked in the restaurant business for 25 years. I was a dishwasher, I was a cook for 5 years, I was a waiter for 2 years, I was a kitchen manager, general manager, I was a partner in 3 restaurants, and I ran a restaurant company. So I like to think that I have a pretty good understanding of the effect of tipping in the restaurant environment. On top of that, I've had the pleasure of partnering with my colleague Mike Van Nassau the last year and a half, and we've been doing a ton of research on tipping. We've been looking at how tipping affects organizations, how much money servers make per hour, all sorts of things like that. Couple that with giving a really thorough reading of the literature that's already produced, I think I have an idea of tipping as an issue. And I'm going to share some of my opinions, or I'd rather say maybe I'll spread a few ideas with you today that are worth spreading. And the first one I'd like to put forth to you, and this may be eye-opening, but I doubt it. The first thing I'm going to say is that servers make a good amount of money. Does that surprise anyone? Mike and I did some research. We asked a bunch of servers to tell us how much they made per hour, and we found that the range was anywhere from $20 to $30 an hour in cash tips. These servers are making $8.65 an hour, minimum wage, plus they're making $10 to $30 an hour. So let's say the range of a server hourly wage is between $20 and $40. I think given the skill needed to be a server, I think that's pretty good, $20 to $40. Good for them. What I take issue with is if I look in the back of that kitchen The average Ontario cook is making $13 an hour, 2 to 3 times less than a server. Why do I take issue with that? First and foremost, many of these people that are cooking in our restaurants or enter the restaurant industry of cooks as a cook have gone to school for that. Colleges in Ontario will graduate 10,000 culinary students a year. These are students that go out and pay tuition, they apprentice, they buy and invest in equipment, and then they go out into the restaurant industry, and in many cases, hi, how are you? Here's 12 bucks an hour. Here's 14 bucks an hour. There's another position in the restaurant that I doubt you've ever heard of because I just created it this week as I was preparing for this talk. And that is called the mercenary restaurant worker. And this is the person that floats around our industry like a hawk. And they're looking for an opportunity to make quick cash. They have no vested interest, none whatsoever in the industry. They may have student debts to pay off. Sorry. They're floating around and they're just waiting to go into that restaurant industry, take as much cash as they can, do the simple, sort of easy job, and get out. Like mercenaries, get in and out. And this has led to a very important point I want to bring up. Servers, in many cases, and not in every case, have this mercenary approach with no vested interest in our industry. So what do? They come in and they leave. They come in and they leave. Cooks that are graduating from our colleges are making $13 an hour. In 2 years, they'll be making $14.50 an hour, barely above the poverty line. So what do? They leave the industry. You can't raise a family on that. So we have 2 things happening simultaneously in the restaurant business, both related back to tipping. And that is this inequality of the distribution of wages in a restaurant. You have cooks that are undervalued and servers that are making an inflated amount of money. And both are leaving in and out of the restaurant business. Everyone in this room knows that the restaurant business is a transient business, correct? Yes. In North America. It's not in Europe. People carve professions, careers in the restaurant business as cooks and servers in Europe, in many places. Colleagues and friends of mine have owned restaurants, and they come over here and it's like, whoa. Tipping, I'm going to put forth today in this talk, is at the root cause of the transient nature of the restaurant business. It's one of the key driving factors. And the economic realities for restaurateurs are huge with that. Cooks are being marginalized. Their livelihoods challenged to earn a living because of tipping. Now, some people will ask me, and I often get this question, well, why don't restaurant owners pay more to cooks? Unfortunately, there's an economic reason they can't. First and foremost, server minimum wage increased almost 40% between the years, this is in Ontario, between the years 2006 and 2010 in Ontario, which really, really hurt restaurateurs. We all thought in the public and the government of the day thought this was great because servers are hardworking and they don't make a lot of money. $20 to $40 an hour is not a lot of money. So let's raise their minimum wage. Well, that really hurt restaurateurs and their ability to pay cooks. And if we break down the pie of restaurant compensation, you will see that 65% of that money, includes the tips because that's part of the compensation for people, is already pre-allocated and the restaurant owner has no say in where that money goes. No control because it's either minimum wage dollars and it's tips, 65%. So restaurateurs have 35% to play with, and to be honest with you, it just doesn't work. If we look at some restaurants, and this is a new sort of organic happening in the last decade or so, there are some restaurants that are practicing what is called tip sharing. And this is a reaction to this huge inequity in these front of house server wages and these kitchen wages. And what they are doing is they're now asking the server at the end of the night, they're saying, hey, we need you to tip out 2% of your sales or 3% of your sales to us. We're going to put it in a pot and redistribute it because you know what? You guys just make way too much money and I can't pay the guys in the kitchen enough or the hostesses. And this is where I look at it and I said, this is great. You know, it's good. We're shifting, and when we speak to cooks, we're shifting the equivalent of about $1 more an hour to them from the servers. So is it good? Yes. Does it make a difference? No. And when I look at this question of equality, I keep going back to value creation, something my colleague Mike is always putting into my head. And I mentioned I have 25 years of experience in restaurants. I look and I can take an educated look at the value created by a cook in a restaurant, producing the meal, cooking it, and putting it up hot and fresh for me. And then I look at the server, and I look at the value that they create for my experience, my overall dining experience. You know what? It's pretty close. It's pretty close. The value creation for my dining experience, I think, is pretty even between the front, the server, and the cook in the back. I'm a person that believes in equal pay for equal work and equal value creation, and that's why I think really there should be more equity in this relationship between the front of the house. And I will tell you, and I'm very proud to say, there are a few people that are addressing this beyond tip sharing, and one of the restaurants is downtown Guelph, Artisanal. And the owner, since he's moved, Yasser, has made a commitment to take the tips and try to make everyone in the restaurant make the same amount of money in the front and in the back. And there's a restaurant in Toronto called Paintbox Bistro that's doing the same. And I really take my hat off to these people, and hopefully they're leading some change in the industry. The last thing I'd like to draw your attention to is some of the other things that tipping does that you probably have never even thought about in a restaurant. First of all, those of you who have worked in a restaurant may notice that there's sometimes some animosity between the back of house, the kitchen, and the front of house. Mike and I did some research, and we were able to determine that some of that is because of the value of work people perceive. The kitchen feels that they are underpaid for the value they create, and the servers create or make more than they create. So they have a little bit of animosity to the front of house. And I think that's present in many restaurants. It also messes around with other relationships. Servers to servers. Anyone who's worked in the restaurant always knows there's a table hog who's stealing your tables or muscling in on your section, right? And there's barking and arguing over tips left, and I'm a bartender and I serve them the drink and I should get it. And the poor hostess, the 15-year-old hostess at the front, the server comes and chews them up because you just sat me 2 families in a row and I want some business people. So there's lots of ramifications as far as relationships. There's also administration of 2 compensatory systems. So in restaurants, we have our regular payroll, like all organizations, where you're paid by the hour. We enter that in the computer, and a check comes out. Okay? Especially with tip sharing, we got to worry about this whole secondary compensatory system. So we have to manage 2 payroll systems, time-consuming and costly. What Mike and I found out as well, when tip sharing does occur, okay, the redistribution of this money, when the owner takes it at the end of the night, the manager, there becomes trust and transparency issues, which is not good for any organization. I'm giving this money, where's it going? I heard the dishwasher's only making 50 cents an hour, yet I'm tipping this and that. So there's all sorts of issues that come as a result of tipping. So if we look back to my talk and we just think about things, and this is where I want you to rethink tipping, is as a consumer, are you really using tipping for what it was meant to do? Or are you just going to that automatic tipping behavior in the past? Should that work for you? I'd question it. Should we be tipping on the amount of a bill? Does that make any economic sense whatsoever? That's another point I would ask as a consumer. From a restaurateur and employee point of view, we have to look at this huge inequity in the difference between what cooks and servers are making. And we have to ask, are we, through tipping, contributing to this marginalization of our cooking staff? As an industry, perhaps the most important thing that I've put forth today is, does this system of tipping that is embedded in our culture, embedded in our economic system of restaurants, is it one of the driving forces to the transient nature of our business? The word on the street is, it's hard work and it's long hours and that's why no one wants to do it. Maybe true, but I would say that tipping is a key driver. So as I wrap up my discussion today, I'd like you to think about these issues. As a society, we are continuously reevaluating the systems that we live in and that revolve around us. And I would just ask that when you rethink tipping, that you add this convention of tipping to that list of things to rethink. Thank you.